Hi guys, today I'm doing a tag that was created by SHAWN the Book Maniac and in which Maria from MH Books tagged me. It is called the Mookse and the Gripes bucket list tag, but in spite of the somewhat eccentric title, the tag just asks for an ordinary reading bucket list. But the creator Sean Mooney was inspired to make this tag by an episode from the podcast called The Mookse and the Gripes, and he has asked that a reference to the podcast be kept in the title. And in addition, in the show notes, you will find links and further references. Just keep in mind that this is Sean's endorsement and it doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of the individual tag video makers. So this tag asks us to name 10 books which, for one reason or another, we want to have read or feel like we should have read by the time we hit the bucket, but which aren't necessarily very high on our priority list or on our TBRs. And in addition, as a bonus, we can also have you, the audience, vote in the comments on which book or books you think we should prioritize. But more about that later. So without further ado, here are my 10 books or something like that. So my number one author is one that I'm sure is on many reading bucket lists out there. It's Vladimir Nabokov. But the first book of his, and maybe the only book of his that I want to read, is not Lolita. Because, to be honest, at this point, I've heard so much about it that I feel like I've already read it. And I'm convinced at this point that it could never be a revelation to me. So the book of his that I want to read instead is Pale Fire. Because I think the concept behind this is so, maybe not unique, but definitely very original. This is the story of a scholar who has died recently under what may or may not have been suspicious circumstances, and the book is written in the form of an edition of a poem of the dead scholar, and the edition was done by a frenemy, or at least a colleague of his, who may or may not have been involved in the death. And so it is structured like any edition, with an introduction, an edition of the poem, and then a lengthy line commentary. And in this commentary in particular, I think the story of the death and of the scholar's life unfolds. And this is whimsical in such an intelligent way that is just exactly my thing, and I would have picked this up much earlier if it didn't sound like so much work that has to be done on the part of the reader. But this is actually quite high on my priority list. I'm just having trouble making myself actually picking it up. Bucket list book number 2, by contrast, I have picked up more than once, but never successfully. It's Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie. And I am so interested in this story, the story or stories of a number of people who were born on the stroke of midnight on the day that India achieved its independence. So interesting, and by such an acclaimed author. However, I found the narrative style frustratingly old school. The story is told from the perspective of a more or less omniscient narrator in the form of an aged man who sits down day by day in his stately mansion to write the story, and he keeps interrupting himself to comment on his present situation and on the state of things. And that in itself I find frustrating because I'm much too impatient for something like that. And in addition, I was never sure, up until page 60 or so, I could never be sure whether or not the narrator was supposed to come across as somewhat of a reactionist, misogynist asshole, or if he's just supposed to seem endearingly grumpy. And this ambivalence has never made me awfully keen to pick this book up again. And yet I'm still hung up on it, and I've never given it away because I want to have read it. It's such a famous book, and the story sounds so interesting. And maybe you get used to the narrator, and maybe he reveals himself at some point as an unambiguous asshole, or maybe he gets better. I don't know. But yeah, I still want to have read it at some point in my life. Book number 3 might turn out to be a bit pretentious as well, but it definitely doesn't have the reactionist old man problem. It's Imajica by Clive Barker. And this is kind of a genre classic, a fantasy genre classic that has somewhat fallen by the wayside, I think. At least it's definitely not in the focus of the book internet nowadays, but the author Clive Barker is well liked, widely read, quite a famous fantasy author. I've never read anything by him though, I think. This is in its heart a classic quest story, but one that spans parallel universes. And a small number of people are thrown together by fate and have to travel across parallel universes in order to, I don't know, save the world. I guess it's always saving the world in the end, isn't it? And this is one that I'd love to pick up soon, but realistically, I just have a hard time making myself read anything that is over 300 pages, let alone over 500 pages. No, not over 500 pages. What am I saying? It's 800 pages. More than 800 pages. So realistically, I will get to this one whenever. Book number 4, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I've wanted to read this one for forever. And at least I'm at the stage now where I have secured a copy of it. Yay. But what has always deterred me from picking it up is not its depressing theme, actually, but the storyline, of the young woman with dreams and aspirations who comes to the promised land, aka New York City, and is bitterly disappointed and disillusioned. And at this point in time, in 2021, this just seems like such an old and used up storyline. And of course, this is not the fault of the book that was written in the 60s, but still, it is what it is. So I definitely still want to read this, but who knows when I will be in the mood for that particular story again. Number 5, The Unconsoled by Kazuo Ishiguro. With the exception of Clara and the Sun, which I just haven't gotten to yet, haven't been in the mood for yet, with the exception of that, this is the only novel by Ishiguro that I haven't read yet. And I'm not a completionist normally, but I am ambitious and I'm so close to the end with Ishiguro. This is a Kafkaesque fever dream of a novel, and I read the first 30 pages once, and I thought, oh, this is cool and interesting, but I just cannot imagine reading 20 times again that much. And I just have never picked it up again after that. Number 6 is the only real nonfiction book on my list. It's Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez. And I really, really want to read this while the Arctic still bears any resemblance to the Arctic that Barry Lopez saw and wrote about. And with the last 4 entries on my list, I'm cheating somewhat because they are all not single books but series or whole oeuvres. So entry number 7 is a series. It's the Aubrey Maturin series by Patrick O'Brian, and I have a lot of the books already, as you can see, because in England any decently sized used bookshop will have copies of Patrick O'Brian's novels. I've never not found a Patrick O'Brian novel in a used bookshop in England. And I've actually read the first 5 books in the series already. So that's Master and Commander, Post Captain, HMS Surprise, The Mauritius Command, and Desolation Island. And up to and including The Mauritius Command, I thought that each of the books was better than the last one, except maybe the last 2, HMS Surprise and The Mauritius Command. Those 2 are maybe on par. But yeah, Desolation Island, the 5th book, wasn't really bad. It was just not as gripping as the other 4. But I definitely want to finish this series at some point in my life, and I've enjoyed reading each of the books that I've read so far. Entry number 8 would be Cormac McCarthy's oeuvre. The books of his that I have read are, in reading order, The Road, Child of God, and No Country for Old Men. And except for Child of God, which I think seems a bit over the top in a somewhat immature manner at this point. It may have had a different impact when it was first published in the 70s, or maybe even the end of the 60s, no, 1973. But nowadays, I'm not sure, but I liked both The Road and No Country for Old Men a lot. But those were his 2 last novels, if I'm not mistaken. No Country for Old Men. That's the last one, isn't it? I think they are the last 2. So I'm curious to see what his middle work will seem like to me. And the one that I'm most curious about is Blood Meridian, but it is, of course, also probably the hardest one to read. And I have another 2 books of his, All the Pretty Horses and The Crossing, which are books 1 and 2 in the Border trilogy, but it's a loose trilogy and you can read them independently of each other. But I'm more interested in the first book in the series, All the Pretty Horses, anyway. But yeah, we shall see when I can psych myself up to picking up another Cormac McCarthy. Maybe every 2 years or so, I'm not sure. The second to last spot belongs to John le Carre. I have accumulated a lot of John le Carre books in recent years. Most of them I've actually found for free in little free libraries, and the other ones I got at very low prices used. And I have to admit, I did not like his first book, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. I think that's his first novel. It's definitely the first of the famous John Smiley novels. While I did not like that one, I still very much like the idea of a knowledgeable writer who writes spy fiction that isn't cheap, action-packed thrillers and doesn't feed nationalist sentiments. So his whole work, much of which I already own, is on my list. And the 3 ones that I think I'm most interested in are the famous Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, if only because of the catchy title. A Perfect Spy, which is about a spy who disappears and then his double life comes to light. And The Little Drummer Girl, which is set in the context of the Mossad, but from what I've heard, the actions of the Mossad and the underlying political views are more and more questioned in the course of the story, and that sounds very good and very interesting to me. And last but certainly not least, James Herriot's work. James Herriot is the Yorkshire vet who wrote All Creatures Great and Small, the story of a Yorkshire vet, which is somewhere between memoir and autofiction. And after this was hugely successful, he followed it up with a host of other similar books about the practice of veterinary medicine in Yorkshire. And the books that I have are All Things Wise and Wonderful, which is the second book that he wrote, his dog stories, which is the most exciting book of his for me, and Vet in Harness. To be honest, the stories can be a little repetitive already in the first book, but I just love the setting so much, and Herriot manages to be at the same time realistic and romanticizing, and this is just such a great combination, and I plan to slowly read his books and his stories over the course of my life. So this was my book bucket list, and now it's voting time. So I will ask you to please, in the comments, pick 2 books from this list which you think I should prioritize, and the one book that gets the most votes, I will try and read that book. I will try my best to read this book in the course of the next year. So let's say until the end of September 2022. Because this is quite a long list, seeing as there are so many series and whole corpora of books on this list. So I should really get started and make a dent in it as soon as possible. And now, of course, it's time to tag somebody. I'm tagging Mariana from Mariana Mas Books, who is still a very new booktuber. And I'm also tagging Amanda from Overbooked, because I'd really like to know if she has a bucket list like that at all. So do check out their channels, they are both lovely. Thank you for watching, and thank you for voting. I'll see you very soon, guys. Bye!